My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. The 2024 national elections kicked off right here in New York, where Democratic former Congressman Tom Suozzi reclaimed his old seat in a special election made necessary when Republican George Santos, a bizarre fraudster, was kicked out of the House of Representatives by the Republican majority. Suozzi's win flipped the seat and gave Democrats a big boost as they try to reverse the razor-thin Republican majority, even as Democrats are on the defensive, trying to hold on to their even narrower majority in the U.S. Senate. All of the pundits, and speaking as a former pundit, are mining Suozzi's win for messages about how this year's campaign will proceed, as we're facing a likely rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Is politics being nationalized, as many pundits suspect, or does the old dictum by the late House Speaker Tip O'Neill that all politics is local still apply? We're here to assess the lay of the land, including what's at stake for CUNY students and all young voters who, while traditionally among the lowest turnout cohort, are showing signs of being activated in numbers that we have not seen before. Steve Romalewski is the director of CUNY's mapping service at the Center for Urban Research, a timely panelist as the state legislature has just changed congressional district lines for the third time in 2 years. That could affect outcomes. Nayela Amaru is a political activist and Democratic strategist and a PhD student at the CUNY Graduate Center who has been in the trenches working with young voters here and across the country. Basil Smikle is the director of public policy programs at Hunter College's Roosevelt House, a former director of the state Democratic Party, and a regular commentator on MSNBC, which I guess makes you a pundit too. And Jeff Colton is a political reporter for Politico and co-author of the Daily Politico Playbook, who will tell us what it all means. Steve, you're the mapping guru. Let me start with you. As we're taping, this is right after the Democratic legislators in Albany drew up new maps, not that different from what the Independent Commission did, but it looks like these maps hurt an upstate Republican congressman who nobody even in the Republican Party likes, but doesn't make any really profound changes. Why did this happen? How did this all play out?
Well, I could go into a lot of detail about the sordid history of how it came to be now, but I guess the one thing to remember is that redistricting is not destiny. The legislature or whoever is in charge of redistricting, whether it's an independent commission, how it might change in the future, we don't know, has to draw new lines after every decennial census because the population has changed and the population of each district basically has to be the same to preserve the one person, one vote principle, population equality. And so the congressional lines are redrawn, the state Senate and state assembly lines are redrawn, as well as New York City Council and other local. And so there was a new process this time around that didn't quite work out. There was one lawsuit that was brought predominantly by Republican plaintiffs that forced the lines, the legislative lines for Congress to be redrawn because they were deemed unconstitutional.
This was for the 2022 elections.
Right. And then another lawsuit was brought by predominantly Democratic plaintiffs that forced the lines to be redrawn again. And the Independent Redistricting Commission stepped in and drew the lines. The legislature said, no, we're going to draw our own lines, but they didn't really make changes much. But you know, it's hard to say. There's a lot of speculation about what this will mean for the control of the House of Representatives, and you know, which seats will flip. It depends so much. Very much of the politics is local, or through that lens perspective, because it depends on candidates. The 3rd district is a great example. So the lines were redrawn, and Biden would have won that district. And George Santos won that district, and then just shortly thereafter, Tom Suozzi wins the same district. So it's no guarantee that simply by drawing the lines, that will ensure that you know, it'll go red or blue.
Basil, you know, the ultimate argument over redistricting is, should politicians pick their voters or voters pick their politicians? And but what happened in 2022 in New York, we went far to the right in terms of Republicans taking seats that were Democratic held, while the rest of the country produced pretty much of a Democratic wave. And, you know, I believe that we're obsessed because we're junkies. We're obsessed with things like redistricting. But Swazi's messaging was very mainstream. You know, Swazi ran a campaign attuned to a district that had rejected Democratic voters. What do you learn from that?
Well, you know, for a long time in New York, we always thought our Republicans were different than the rest of the country. That is no longer the case. George Pataki is not walking through that door anytime soon. And you know, the thing about Tom Swazi, and I worked with Tom Swazi back in 2006 when he was trying to be governor. That was, I think, 4 governors ago, or 3 governors ago. You know, he always represented very well, and he was the former mayor of Glen Cove, if I remember correctly, and represented the suburb very, very well.
And the county executive.
And county executive. And then so what I think has been interesting, number one, is that Democrats had done well in the suburbs, and we've done better. We sort of outperformed, and that, you know, was really helpful in 2022. But when Tom Swazi runs for governor, he runs to the right of Kathy Hochul, particularly on this issue of crime. Something that, as a Democrat, I was concerned that we weren't pulling back on that narrative. We weren't taking over that narrative, sort of ceded that to Republicans. It partly bail reform, but not entirely. There were a lot of other issues that were at play here that I think Democrats ceded to Republicans on. And Swazi sort of took that and understood exactly where he was and where he was coming from, and ran the campaign that he did, ultimately losing, but quite frankly, that set the stage for how he would run in this special election. To the right, I guess, of even Joe Biden, and went after him, attacked him. And I think voters in that district really wanted to see that. Again, I do feel that Republicans were successful at taking the migrant issue away from Democrats, taking the narrative of crime away from Democrats, racializing and urbanizing that issue. Because I don't know that there's high crime in Glen Cove right now, but they were very good at sort of co-opting that. He seized on that, ran locally in the ways that he had to, again, in the ways that I said, but also did one thing that Democrats have found success on, and that is attaching the most draconian reproductive rights policies to Republicans, right? And by doing that, really balancing the local and the national, you know, I think he was successful. And I do think in many ways it's a model for Democrats running in those types of districts.
Layla, we also are taping this right after the Michigan primary, where you saw a significant, on the Democratic side, you saw a significant people going for uncommitted, which was one of the options. And that is interpreted, I think, correctly. There's a huge Arab American population in Michigan and great concern over the Israel-Hamas war. But also you've seen these kinds of progressive mainstream, for want of a better thing, fights within the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders' various campaigns. And, you know, one of the things, we've talked about this beforehand, is there's, you know, a move to boycott the election. How do you motivate? Are young people more, but yet young people are turning out in greater numbers than they used to. How do you assess that?
Absolutely. I think it's important to hold space and acknowledge, young voters in general, but particularly young voters, have the right to be frustrated with the way the current system operates, right? It's incredibly cumbersome.
We all were at that age.
Absolutely. Who amongst us has not been frustrated with the political process at some point? And I think just to recognize that, right? And also within that same breath, also have honest conversations with ourselves and say, who is in a position of privilege to say, I choose not to engage in policies and systems and practices that have disparate impacts, maybe not on me directly, but on the folks that I proclaim to want to protect and to have policies support and protect. With that said, you know, younger voters generally tend to be more drawn towards issues more so than specific candidates or parties. And I think that is something that both parties, speaking through a partisan lens, really need to be intentional about rethinking how they engage younger voters. Not just the first-time voter, right, but also to make sure that they keep coming back and again, and that way you do have a committed Democrat voter and not just a first-time voter or not a voter who comes up, you know, and votes every 4 years for a presidential, but does engage in the local municipal elections, which I would argue all politics is local and has just as much, if not a more direct impact on the younger voters in particular.
This question of, you know, one of the great Jeff, one of the great organizing principles for the Democratic Party is somebody named Donald Trump, who is, from a purely political motivating perspective, is a great motivator. And, you know, I don't particularly think he believes anything that he's saying in terms of, you know, reproductive freedom, in terms of, you know, all the kind of right-wing stuff that all the Christian nationalist stuff that he's playing with. Assess this in terms of, you know, I think our Republicans used to be, you know, John Lindsay Republicans, George Pataki Republicans, but they're not. So, I mean, give me the lay of the land.
There's a fascinating situation going on right now in the Republican primary for U.S. Senate. So Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat, currently the senator. The Republicans are looking to bring a candidate forth to run against her. The Republican Party overwhelmingly nominated this guy, Mike Saperconi. He's a retired NYPD detective, and he's probably one of those guys you'd consider to be an old school New York Republican. He has criticized Trump before. He's said the basic line of something like, you know, nobody is above the law. And he is a businessman. He owns a security business. He's donated primarily to Republicans, hundreds of thousands of dollars to Republicans, but he's donated a little bit to Democrats too. Now that's the guy they nominated. There is an all-out like assault against him within the Republican Party now, saying this guy is not Trump enough. They're saying this guy, he donated to Letitia James, the Attorney General who's, you know, prosecuting Trump, and in return, Saperconi, the Republican nominee, is completely embracing Trump. He tweeted a picture of the president saying, "I love this guy. We got to get behind him." He gave reporters like myself a quote saying, "You know, I went to a Mets game once with Trump and we shared a hot dog just to show his affinity for Trump." So yes, basically the Republican Party, even in New York, if they try to nominate somebody who has a little more mainstream appeal, maybe a little hesitant about Trump, the base of the party has responded and said, no, we demand full loyalty, full loyalty to Trump.
And we have closed primaries. So we don't, you know, it's not like South Carolina or New Hampshire where independents can vote in the Democratic primary.
Exactly. It's only Republicans that are going to vote in this June primary. And because it's a closed primary, it's generally the more motivated, more loyal Republicans that are voting. So to get through a primary, to even get to run against Kirsten Gillibrand in November, he has to get through the primary. So yes, he's running to the right. He's embracing the MAGA Trump side of things, and I think it really just speaks to this issue that you're talking about of whether the Republican Party can differentiate itself from Trump. And just briefly, I think we saw that in the Swazi race too, that Basil was speaking about. I think that the Swazi team did a good job of attaching Pillip to the more extreme elements of the Republican Party,
particularly on reproductive.
Yeah. Exactly.
Issues.
Whereas Swazi did a very good job of showing himself as a moderate, and he has that record. He has those connections, and I think there were a lot of folks that said, "I just want the more moderate candidate," and he was the obvious choice in that case.
You know, one of the things in districting, I read this. What is it? The Center for American Politics, which uses some of your data analysis in deciding whether a district is a toss-up, it leans, it's solidly for one party or another. And one of the things that you look at is what happened in the presidential election within those census tracts that make up the particular district. Is that predictive?
What's the financial dictum that past performance is no guarantee of future? You know, it is really hard to tell. I mean, there are kind of general patterns, and actually it's interesting talking about how the there's the presidential turnout in New York City, I'm talking about anyway. And then for the other elections, for state office or for local council, the turnout drops tremendously. And it's interesting because you're probably much more impacted as a New Yorker by your council member than the policies they enact, or by the state legislature than president. I mean, obviously everyone's impacted by the president of the national policies, but turnout is much lower for these local elections. So that's a general pattern. And there are substantial pockets of the city that tend to vote Republican or Democrat. But it's
increasing pockets to voting Republican, actually.
Yeah, but it goes back and it's cyclical. And it's so dependent on candidates and on the issues of the day. So it's hard to say. You know, I was looking at some of the maps that we've made going back over the mayoral elections. And when you look at the patterns of votes for Republican mayor candidate or Democrat, they're generally the same across the 5 boroughs, but there are key differences. We've had Republican mayors, and we've had pretty strong Democrats run against those Republican mayors. Like in 2009, when Bill Thompson ran against Mayor Bloomberg, Thompson did generally well in typical areas where Democrats at that level, executive level races, do well.
I think Bloomberg he had been a Democrat, then he was a Republican. I think he may have been an independent at that point before he became a Democrat again, but that's just for accuracy.
Bill Thompson was the Democratic candidate, and he lost. And even though he did okay percentage-wise in those areas, Southeast Queens, Central Brooklyn, South Brooklyn, large area of the Bronx, Manhattan's relatively liberal Upper West and East Sides, the turnout wasn't anywhere near enough.
Yeah, but
and then a year later, Obama did great in those areas.
But looking at that, because we're again have no lives and look at this stuff, Billy Thompson did very well in the best of the 3 runs because it was the 3rd run and because people were punishing Bloomberg for having pulled the shenanigans he did to be able to run for a 3rd term. I'm not sure. Absent that, you look at this stuff.
Well, also for full disclosure, I worked on that Bloomberg campaign.
But he was punished because
third terms are always hard.
Won.
Third terms are always hard. Right?
Also, it helps to have $100 million to drop on the campaign.
Third terms are always hard. How he got the 3rd term was obviously very controversial, but third terms are always hard.
Yes.
Ed Koch, Mario Cuomo, even George Pataki, all very difficult because voters just get tired of you. As good as a job as you might do, voters just get tired of you and want to go in a different direction. But yeah, I think the margin was like 3 or 4 points.
Yes, I think it was.
And so it was very close. Yes, the $102 million or whatever it was that Bloomberg ultimately spent.
Rich or poor, it's good to have money. That's what my ninth
But I would always argue that message comes before money because there are plenty of rich people in this country that have run and lost because they just didn't have that appeal. And I think, and it's interesting because fast forward, I worked on another campaign from here in 2021. And all of the polling said that New Yorkers still kind of liked Mike Bloomberg, that they just liked a manager. And that's why I often say that New York is not ideological. I think we're 6-1 Democrat to Republican, whatever the number is, maybe 7-1 now. But New York is its own ideology. Voters just want someone who is for New York. And it was amazing how, as de Blasio's ending, that voters are, and maybe there are a lot of other reasons for this, but there are a lot of voters that just liked Mike Bloomberg's management style.
Nayela, there ain't no way in hell a Republican's going to carry the presidential election in New York this fall. We're a bank account, where people, candidates come to raise money. Mm-hmm. But if you got to worry about New York, the election is over. So, and I think Basil's touching on something that, we're less ideological, but young people tend to be more ideological. Mm-hmm. So there's an inherent conflict, mm-hmm. and I think that's what Biden's experiencing with the Michigan vote, and a lot of it around. It's not only around the Israel-Hamas war. I think it's broader. I think that, and I think we saw it play out again in the Bernie Sanders. I mean, I'm looking to you as the young person representative on this panel.
Absolutely, it's a fair point. Listen, I think that as we go through our journey as voters and as our position in life, transitions and evolves, sometimes our ideologies do, and sometimes our priorities and where they sit within those ideologies do, right? And so I think it's a fair point. I think that the younger voters are really drawn towards big structural reform to address all the things that plague society, which is a lot, right? But government does not work that way. Government focuses on incremental change, taking into consideration a lot of different political variables of what can be done within the political calendar, within the political landscape, with the candidates and incumbents that we have. All these different, considerations lead to progressive policy reform, but maybe not as progressive or as drastic as younger voters would like. And it is a point of tension, right? When you're talking about how do you secure and build a base of youth voters who so deeply are yearning for structural change, but yet the systems that we work within and live in under as citizens and as engaged citizens at that, are working with very different types of structures that do not give credence to big structural reform all at once or all the time.
We've been watching this with the DSA candidates who can win in smaller legislative districts. Frankly, in districts with a lot of younger people, a lot of those are white younger voters. And but when they get into a Bronx congressional district that's now represented by Richie Torres, for instance, come in sixth. And so it's, there is a certain luxury of being young. I was once young. So this tension is bedeviling Democrats. It frankly bedevils Republicans, but it's not an age thing. It's so much of the never Trumpers are not so much an age-based thing. It's and it's not even so much ideology as it is just being appalled at his at his behavior.
I believe we have seen younger people also grow in their affinity for Trump. I believe I've seen that polling. Still, very, very more supportive of Biden than Trump, but over time there's been a shift among a lot of demographic groups, including young people, towards Trump, which I guess that there are reasons for it, but it is frankly a little surprising to me. But I think that it is part of the him being out of power and supporting Trump being coded as revolutionary in a way, as being anti-establishment. And
well, there's also an argument that there's a revolutionary argument that if you make things as bad as possible, you're going to be bringing about the revolution. I'm a child of the 1960s, and I went to one SDS meeting, but they wouldn't let you whisper in the back of the room. So I figured this was really not for me.
And I'll say, as a counter, by the way, yes, it's true that there was a DSA candidate who lost against Richie Torres in the South Bronx district. The rest of the Bronx is represented by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, who are both. Bowman was DSA affiliated, AOC currently is, and then Adriano Espaillat also has a section of the Bronx, and he has one of the most progressive voting records in the entire Congress. So, that is true in some cases, but I think DSA does have to get a lot of credit as an electoral force. And part of that force electorally is not just appealing to people that agree with them ideologically, but also their candidates being, in many cases, very strong on messaging about the more day-to-day issues, the things that are less ideological. I think a lot of those winning candidates have done a good job, and even people that are conservative will still vote for a DSA candidate in some cases, like AOC. We've seen a lot of support in that way.
AOC is a phenomenon. She's one of the most skilled. You're going to jump in, or?
Well, I was going to say, one thing also about how New York's voting system works. You mentioned that we have closed primaries. And so most voters are registered as Democrats in this city, and there is a good chunk registered as Republican, but a greater number are registered without any party. You don't check off the box, you're considered a blank.
That's right.
And they can't vote. in the primaries.
Where elections are essentially
Right.
essentially resolved.
Right, right. So you have, like in these challenges in the Bronx, where there's a big primary election, it's a very limited pool of people that are going to be voting in that. And if you're independent, especially if you're young and you don't want to get involved in the parties, you don't check off that box, you're shut out of the picture.
These kinds of tensions, this kind of messaging beyond the party, that she's talking about, this great institutional change. I mean, we were very impatient, and an argument that makes total sense to me now that because there's incremental change, will bring people. The moral arc of the universe moves towards justice, but it's slow. But it's hard to argue, in my mind, that taking my marbles and going home and not participating is going to do anything to help the kind of people you say you want to help.
Well, I have a lot of students that say they're not going to vote, but there are a lot of adults that say they're not going to vote because they don't like their choices. I think to your point, I've argued that this is going to be more of like akin to a parliamentary election because it seems like more and more people don't like Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So my thing is, look at the agendas. Just if you don't like the individuals at the top of the ticket, just compare the agenda, right? I'm voting for the party that's going to increase my ability to vote, not decrease it. I'm going to vote for the party that's going to increase the opportunity for women of color to have better health care and be able to secure their reproductive rights. So I think from that point of view, that's the argument that I've been making, but there are a lot of folks that say they still don't want to participate. And look, I was young once, as we all were. Apartheid was the movement of my generation, right? And I saw Bill Clinton on Arsenio Hall. Young people have no idea who Arsenio Hall is or was at that time. The only black man, only black person on late night television, and Bill Clinton goes on that show and plays a saxophone.
Wearing
sunglasses. And it was the only show that featured hip hop artists. And I grew up with hip hop. So to me, he did the thing that I needed a candidate to do, which was talk to me, come to me where I'm at, right? And I think there is a lack of that in many ways with these candidates, and that's become part of the problem. So because they have to be where young people are. But I would say also that there's another dynamic that to me is underreported. As this country becomes more and more diverse, where we historically do not vote on foreign policy, there's so many first-generation Americans, I am one, my parents are Jamaican immigrants, that spend a lot of time, particularly with social media, being able to learn about and follow the news of where my family came from. And as that becomes more and more prevalent in this country, we will hold our leaders more accountable for the decisions they make in foreign affairs. And I think that's one dynamic that we're seeing right now that I think both parties have historically taken for granted. We used to see that with Cuban Americans a lot, but now we're seeing it with many more nationalities.
One of the things that Biden, one of his, when you watch politicians, there's always one line that they repeat constantly again and again. And for Biden, it's don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And I think we're in a time where there's people, for all the districting that's going on, there's a very negative motivation. I'm more voting against Donald Trump than I'm necessarily voting for Joe Biden. And, I think that, you mentioned voting rights. I mean, the Republican goal is to kind of kick out all these people who keep voting the wrong way, just block people from voting. I mean, it's frankly, it's a pretty disgraceful aspect of what they're doing. But there's a negative motivation that you're appealing to.
But something to throw into the mix is that, so you're talking about either or. At the local level in New York City, the city has decided to look at a different type of voting for primary elections for city council, which is ranked choice voting.
Yes.
Which means it's not either or. Right. You could have 10 candidates and you pick your top 5. And that gives people so much more flexibility and ability to you don't have to be the top one. You could pick your second, third, fourth, or fifth candidate. and it all kind of works out that way. So it gives people more say, and their votes matter more that way. Will that happen for presidential primaries or federal, state? Who knows?
Well, it could,
it's-
because I think the state could organize its own way of, choosing its delegates, because technically you're voting for delegates, not for.
And there's been some controversy over how it was implemented and how well people understand it, and it's different, so it's a little more. You have to think about it a little bit more, but it's gone well.
I think that people will get used to it. We've had these, Jeff, you and I have had these discussions about ranked choice voting, and people were absolutely up in arms that nobody's going to figure it out.
The mayor himself didn't like it. He
They
was
figured it
opposed.
out.
He won.
They figured it out.
Anyway.
It also, the other thing that ranked choice voting, it disincentivizes you beating up an opposing candidate because you want to get their people in.
So there, the Biden, don't look at the almighty, look at the alternative. It doesn't really make sense, because there's coalitions you build with other candidates, and it's a much more holistic way of the vote of going through the voting process.
And I think that's an important point when it comes to the youth vote, because again, sometimes it's, do we pick our poison, hold our nose, and vote for the candidate that we really don't like, but if we don't want the worst to happen, then so shall it be?
Absolutely.
Versus-
that's the choice they face.
Right. Versus imagining and organizing and trying to build something completely different, which are your more radical left folks, which choose to opt out of the current system. But it's about access and choice, right? And I think that a lot of young voters, because our current structures are really formal and very rigid and oftentimes can be very exclusive and hard to break into, folks feel like they are presented a candidate that they did not have an opportunity to really be a part of the decision making of, I think this is the best candidate for this particular district. It was already decided in a county committee meeting, a few months ago. And I think that if we are able to reimagine ways that we can engage in the voting process when it comes to candidate selection, when it comes to who and how and when we can vote, I think that's a very empowering process.
It's also, when I went to Brooklyn College, when I started at Brooklyn College, I knew everything. And, now I know nothing. Socrates was the wisest man in the world because he knew that he knew nothing. And, one of the things that does not plague this is a grotesque generalization, but I think there's something to it. Doubt doesn't bother, a lot of younger voters. And when you get older, you kind of, you have battle scars, and you start to realize that an incremental change is worth it because it's going to help people. We grew up, think of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, some of the labor strength, even though labor unions have been weakened, but there's sort of a resurrection going on. You can't tell me that the situation is not better for people today because of those movements, even if it's not, even if it's not the Great Revolution.
Things are definitely better in many cases. But I tell you, I watch what's happening. I saw what happened on January 6th, and I'm like, how did that happen? Right? How did these institutions that we thought would block this, would keep this from happening? How did we let in a president that did a call and response that allowed that to happen? So to me, so in many ways, there are a lot
that's
of
the
things.
threat.
That's today. It's not the
Yes.
threat. It's the reality. Because even if, look, just take off my Democratic hat and just put on just human being from the Bronx hat, right? Even if Trump is not reelected or is not elected in 2024, Trumpism is still going to be around. It's like high school chemistry. Energy is never created nor destroyed, right? So where does all of that go? It has to go somewhere, and a lot of it's still in our institutions. That's what I worry about.
Well, it's also, there's also a question, does fever break? And there's no sign that it's breaking yet. In fact, it's getting more intense on the Republican side. But, you have to hope, or else the Republican Party might, if it does not succeed this year, it might seriously start to fade away, because that's the extreme nature of what we're facing. who knows what comes up. I mean, you know, there's no labels party, which seems to be very, very strange. I don't know. If
The way the two-party system is set up, if they fail, if the Republicans lose badly, then they'll adjust and be back again in 2026. I mean, that's just the nature of the system. I think.
Right. The question is, will they learn? And will they be able, you know, because if they go deeper into the rabbit hole, you know, if you go, you know, you look at who controls the House of Representatives, and the deeper you go in the rabbit hole, the harder it is to climb out. So I don't know if there's a point at which, because you have a lot of Republicans, never Trumpers, who are now saying my party is dead, the Michael Steeles of the world.
But nothing succeeds like success. They all want to win.
Yes.
And at some point they'll find a way, right?
Yes, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Hi, my name is Shuruko Barsiki. I go to John Jay College for Criminal Justice. My question is, in a time where money often dictates political power, how can we ensure that the interests of local communities, especially those who are marginalized, are not sidelined in the political process?
You know, you made the point that money isn't, you know, money's important, but money's not the big. I happen to think that, you know, loyalty is the mother's milk of politics more than money is. But you know, you do see, because of Citizens United, which allowed dark money that is not trackable in immense amounts to kind of start to flow through, you know, politics. You see, you know, basically candidates are farming out their campaigns to these so-called independent PACs. I mean, money. I don't think money's everything, but I think money's a lot.
Money's a lot, especially, look, if you're running a campaign where you got to spend a lot of money on, you need to be on TV, or you need to do, and people still do mail, if you need to do mail, all of that, you know, that costs money. Obviously, that's important, but ultimately, you know, you show up at a subway stop in the morning and get to meet voters, people will see you and people will respond to you. You show up at a church on Sunday, voters will respond to you. You show up, you have to show up. My other argument, my sort of complementary argument to that, is as a former head of state party, we know if you don't vote. And that's a really important point. We know if you don't vote. We have very sophisticated tools that we can attach to the name of a voter, not just obviously where you live, but not just your email, phone number, and gender. We get all of this great information about you as a voter based on your internet searches and the apps on your phone. We can model you to a T. So if you don't vote, we know that. If there are groups of you in neighborhoods that don't vote, we know that. And if you're a candidate, speaking of money, with limited time and limited resources, you have to make these very critical decisions about how much time to spend in different places. And if you see, and this is not me, but I'm just saying any candidate, no matter what the party, if you see that there are chunks of voters that don't regularly come out, knowing how expensive it is to hold that voter's hand and get them to come out, you're going to make some critical decisions.
It's interesting, right? But it's also the case that this may sound counterintuitive, but I think campaign money in congressional races is less important in New York, where you have 10 congressional districts in the city, than it would be in a place where you have one congressional district and it's a much higher profile. You know, it's hard to break through the cacophony of your business, my old business.
Sure, TV ads matter, I suppose, less in New York City because it's very expensive and targeted. I think two things can be true at once. Yes, I guess for a hyper-local example, yes, the Mayor Eric Adams was elected with the support of $1 million donations from some super PACs. At the same time, now that he's mayor, I have personally seen his talking points change directly after a question at a town hall. I mean, if enough, I was just watching a town hall where multiple people asked about e-bikes. And the mayor and his team have been just like completely like freaking out about this and responding, trying to make the right e-bike policy when it comes to deliveries, when it comes to the battery fires. And that's not something that the big donors care about necessarily. That's something that's really grassroots. It's just the individual constituent. So like, yes, big money is absolutely a factor in electing people in politics, but at the same time, local politics is very responsive to people emailing.
You know, among the other things we saw in 2022 and in 2023 in the local elections is the shifting ethnic alliances within the city. You see a significant rise in Republican voting within the Asian American community in particular. And it's for a lot of reasons. It's for crime. It's also for the, progressive opposition to the specialized high school admissions test. I mean, it's a lot of various issues that get into play. You see some significant Republican advance within the Latino community, which I believe is somehow linked to the increasing Pentecostal, evangelical, non-Catholic growth, within the Latino community. So, districting, people who are map making are quite aware of that, aren't they?
Sure. No, we maybe don't follow or attach all of that consumer data to all of this information, but we have a really good sense of how these patterns are shifting. But, I was going to say in terms of how local communities can make themselves heard, it really does start in some ways with drawing the district lines, because the way the process works, let's say at the state level, where the legislature ultimately decides, even with this new sort of independent redistricting process, that, they'll probably listen to people locally, but when you look at New York City, how the district lines were drawn for the city council, it was a much more engaged, I think, conversation and a much more intense discussion about how local people should be represented. It's not like we'll move this community from one place to another like a pawn on a chessboard. It's, we really care, and we want you to draw the lines that reflect us and reflect our communities.
The politics of redistricting, which is always fascinating, there's a strong belief, because the Democrats took it on the chin in 2022 in terms of losing districts, that Hakeem Jeffries, who is from Brooklyn, is the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives, could be, if some of these seats change, the Speaker of the House. He was the first one out of the box saying, I don't like these lines. And, presumably he's in the business of protecting his Democratic incumbents in New York. So, has anybody figured out Hakeem's, Jeffries' role in this? That kind of bigfooting. And he's got about as big a foot as there is in politics right now.
Part of the problem with how the process works now is that we don't know, and we may never know, because there's no requirement to make all that information public. But it should be, because these lines, we have a online mapping project called Redistricting NU, because everyone is impacted by redistricting, whether you like it or not. But that information isn't publicized. So we may never know whether there is an effort to tip the scales. The legislators will say, no one talked to us about this, blah, blah, blah. We have to take them at their word. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't.
But even the questions about Jeffrey's involvement in this underlines the national implications of what happens in New York.
Well, what is it? There are 18 congressional districts across the country that Biden won, currently represented by Republicans. 6 of them are in New York. Mm-hmm. So we just got one back, right? So yeah, it's the difference between him being the first black speaker or not. And he clearly is, got a lot at stake here. And you alluded to this before. When does New York play this heavily in national politics, right? Unless we actually put up our own candidate. We are, I think, obviously we're a solidly blue state. 6 times since the Great Depression have we voted for a Republican. So we are a big sort of pocketbook, a bank account for candidates. But in this year, with these congressional elections, so much is going to run through New York and California.
Mm-hmm. Joe, what's your sense of, that's the degree to which the redistricting process was in fact nationalized. When you see, I'm assuming that, since Congressman Jeffries publicly said, I don't like these lines that came out of the independent commission, that he was more involved in that. He's a very hands-on, very smart guy.
I was trying to find out how much involvement he had, very hard. And, his team said, no, there was no talking, no back channeling. I'm sure there was some, somehow people seem to know what Jeffries wants, and that's true of
Yeah, but Basil's making the point that, you know, Democratic hopes coming through New York is kind of unique because we are a one-party state.
Oh, there's a lot
and
of
that's why I
pressure.
keep coming back to the question of, for all the discussion about lines, I believe what happened in 2022 was not the lines. I think you could have drawn all kinds of lines, but it was a messaging that drove that election. That and I am not technically capable of saying if you redid this in this structure it was a messaging wipeout that happened, relative wipeout that happened. So I mean, are we too obsessed with lines?
Well,
I mean, it's your business.
As a map maker. But I would, whenever I would talk to the press about this, I would always try to emphasize that, the horse race stuff, maybe it doesn't matter as much, like you're suggesting. You really need to, like the decision that just happened in the new congressional lines in District 16, represented by Jamel Bowman, where Co-op City, it wasn't moved, but the line was redrawn so that they're now again in District 16. They used to be in District 14 this past cycle.
They were in Ocasio-Cortez's district.
And in the past, they've been.
But that has an
District
implication
16.
in the Democratic primary,
But
because as opposed to necessarily in a general election where that district is more likely to be Democrat, whether Bowman wins or George Latimer wins.
But the attention on it was, like I was saying, they're a chess piece. And Co-op City is being moved around and the lines are being redrawn. Well, what do people in Co-op City think? What is, do they like being in a district that includes part of Queens? Do they want to be in a district that's part of Westchester? Maybe they do, but the focus is not on them. And they're going to have to we all are going to have to live with these lines, regardless of who's in office, for the next, maybe not 10 years, because it's been so chaotic these past couple of years, but for a good number of years going forward. So in some ways, we matter, the voters, more than the elected officials and the red-blue debate.
Yes, sir. Tell us your name and your campus.
My name is Major Namlaw, and I'm from Queens College. My question is, since nowadays a lot of young voters get their media from either Twitter or mainline sources like CNN and whatnot about national stuff, how do you think that would affect local stuff?
Well, the role of social media in, this is where I am highly not competent to discuss, but the role of social media creating, I believe that as technology fragmented the media, everybody's receded to their ideological silos, and it's been destructive of finding a common ground. But that's how people get their information today.
It is, and I always encourage folks to be critical consumers of information and to diversify your reading list, right? I am very intentional about reading outlets that I fundamentally disagree with,
right.
But need to understand their arguments, who is saying what, why, what is their rationale, to either challenge, my own position, to reaffirm why I was, in the position that I had to begin with. I also think it's important just to acknowledge the importance of local media and local journalism. Without going too deep into the weeds, there's been a lot of loss in coverage of what's happening locally in neighborhoods as an industry. And I am concerned about what that impact has on, not just voters, but particularly younger voters who are new to the process of exploring media outlets and, consuming news and being intentional about thinking about what the issues are and how they're presented if we do not have a field to write about it. And so then you are parsing out, what local issues to folks who are not of the community, which is a really wrong approach in terms of really having a nuanced understanding what the issues are and to whom.
Good.
I think it's a good question because I think races are in part more nationalized because of that. Because more people are getting their news from CNN or the New York Times or just Twitter, where you can get news from all over the world and all over the country. There are some benefits to that. I mean, I think that Congress members' vote on national issues is obviously very important, and they should be held accountable on that, and not just the potholes. But there's certainly a change.
If I just add very quickly, it actually goes to your point about local elections. It makes it harder for the candidates with little money to influence the the wave of information that a person would get.
However, the fragmentation and the silos also can be used as an organizing tool at the same time.
It's small d democratizes mobilization. It definitely
in a
does
weird,
that.
in a weird way.
And I'll just say very quickly, I was speaking upstate New York one day, had 4 hours to kill. What do you do when you have 4 hours to kill in Ithaca, New York? You get a tattoo. So I was getting a tattoo. And I always ask people this, like, where do you get your news? And he said, YouTube. And it becomes really difficult if you want to create a counter narrative to whatever that person is getting. It becomes difficult to kind of intersect that. Because you have to know where that person is, and then you have to have the resources to create the content to do that. So it's sort of it's a very difficult game of like cat and mouse to try to really narrow down how you create that counter narrative and with whom.
Yes, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
My name is Shauna, and my campus is John Jay College for Community Justice. The question that I have is, when it comes to the primary elections and getting voters to come out, especially youthful voters and people who usually don't vote, what do you think is going to appeal to them to choose Republican or Democrat? Because do they have ideals on issues that they usually focus on to get people to choose a party? Because I know that they cannot vote in the primary elections without choosing a party. So what do you think that a candidate should do in order to get them
You're
to
elected.
As an elected, you have to identify your base and expand your base if you want to win. And so I think, particularly when it comes to youth, as you're figuring out, what issues are most important, to you as a person, to your family, to your community. The conversations I've had with colleagues and younger folks has been, listen, no party may be perfect, but where do you want to go? Where do you want to go, as a society, as a community, however you choose to define that. And then think of the parties as a bus. Which bus route is going to get you closest to where you're trying to go?
Right. And also, as I want to go to one last question, but as I'm, bemoaning people trying to sit out at the same time, trying to decide which party, historically parties start very small, so you can't create a new reality. It's very tough because we have this duopoly, this Democratic-Republican duopoly. There's a lot of room within them. There used to be very liberal Republicans and very conservative Democrats. Now they're polarized, which I think is a reflection of the technological changes that have sent us. So, but there is a longer view, and then there's the immediate choice that you have to make. Let me take one last question.
Sunwoo Kim, and I'm currently attending the City College of New York. And Professor Smickle, I know you mentioned candidates knowing who votes even on a local level and the possibility of that candidates could skip outreach to areas not expected to show up on election day. What could that translate into for those areas after the election? Would they be ignored or receive less services?
But
Yes to both.
Yeah.
That's the challenge, right? You want to get people out to vote because if we are a city of renters, right? Not owners. But where does the sort of locus of political agency reside? Among a lot of areas where you have a lot of owners and high income earners. And so if you don't, and if for one that doesn't agree with that, go look at challenges with the public housing across our city to this day. So yes, if a candidate is counting on certain constituencies not coming out, all of the policy they create is going to exclude those communities, intentionally so, unless and until there is something that brings that person and says, you either come and pay attention to us, or it's going to be a threatening to your political future. Mm-hmm. And there have been opportunities where we've seen that happen. And by the way, I will tie it to a point from earlier, when you talked about the Asian American community. When I started in this business 20 years ago, the Asian American community did not have the power to push back the black community on an issue of the specialized high schools. But with members of Congress, city council members, state assembly, state senate members, there's a political and economic power that that community has that now they have the opportunity to force change in a way that they didn't even 10 years ago. And so now people are like, we got to go there, right? And as a person from a Jamaican community, same thing. You know, my community had the same issue at some point in the past.
Well, you know, it's
so we do that, right? Like you don't want to talk to us now, but you will. And
You know,
what's
but
going to happen? How's that going to?
You know, again, that level of complexity, just as in 1990, Puerto Ricans were less than 50% of the Latino population, meaning immigration moved up. You know, when I was a kid, blacks meant American blacks.
Right, that's right.
Latinos meant Puerto Ricans.
Rican, yeah.
You know, and white people were everything from, you know, Italians and Irish and Jews and stuff like that. And there was a very small pockets of mainly Chinese. When we talk about Asian Americans, it was mainly Chinese. It's a much more complicated
That's right.
city. I think it's a huge plus that we're that much more complicated. I think it's a much more interesting city. But it's politically, you know, navigating it politically is much tougher.
Well, the candidate that recognizes that complexity, because you even said it yourself, that the white community was all of these different ethnicities, but it was Chinese and it was Puerto Rican. It actually wasn't always that. There was still, you know, there's still complexity to all these communities of color in these so-called minority communities, but because my parents have been here since 1970, so
Right.
you know what I mean. So the point
But
being
now
that
you have all these African immigrants. Now you have, you know, within the black community.
That's right.
You have this
That's right.
huge
So there's
African
there isn't, and that's the key. There is no there is no monolith
That's right.
of any.
Everybody's a
any-
minority in a sense.
and that well, and that's why we see the problems nationally, right? Because of this growing minority population, right? But that said, you know, it is the candidate that recognizes the complexity and speaks to that complexity, campaigns to that complexity and those nuances is the candidate that's going to win.
I think it's a beautiful thing about New York, right? I mean, 20 years ago, there was like one Dominican politician in the city. And then as the Dominican population has grown and as more Dominicans have become citizens that can vote, now there's, I don't know, more than a dozen in the city.
And the reality is that first Dominican politician was Guillermo Linares, who was elected to the assembly. And he was opposed by a lot of Puerto Rican power structure that wasn't ready to, in their mind, give up the power. I mean, you had the same thing in one of the mayoral elections, where I think it was Denny Farrell was put up to keep a Latino candidate from winning the mayoral nomination. He was put up at the last time.
Is that Herman Badillo?
I think it was Badillo was poised to win, you know, a primary, and you know, and I think the world of Denny Farrell. We miss him immensely, but you know, there was kind of crass racial politics, if you will, which is much harder to do today. So I mean, you know, it's you look at the numbers. It's a much demographically. We're all over the map, literally.
The coalition approach is absolutely essential. You can't just win with one group or another. We literally.
Well, you can in certain neighborhoods. You can in certain
right.
neighborhoods.
No, I guess I'm thinking of like
Right,
mayor
you can on a
campaign,
district level, right?
or even a congressional campaign, which is they're big, the districts, so they
And
encompass a lot of.
And I wonder about that. This is something that always preoccupies me because I got politically active because I saw Jesse Jackson on TV in '88 saying the party's not being responsive to people that look like me, which meant me, and then David Dinkins wins in ’89. So I wonder if the Democrats have leaned too long on that older coalition and haven't figured out a way they haven't changed it, and which is why we may be having the problems that we have on occasion. I actually wonder about that a lot.
And to that point, I think descriptive representation, race has been a very old, traditional, tried and true organizing tool politically. But for younger folks, descriptive representation doesn't hold the weight that maybe it does for older generations, and they're more interested in ideology of a candidate more so than do.
Well, I think it's also because younger people are growing up in a much more integrated world. I grew up in the projects. I grew up in Linden houses in East New York, and that was integrated. But that was unusual. And so, you know, you did have neighborhoods that were, you know, that were very unipolar for one of them. I don't know what the right word is. We have about 30 seconds left. Since you're the senior pundit, you know, I mean.
Speaking of age.
no, I'm older than you. In about 10 seconds, are we in good shape going forward? I mean, that, you know,
I'm still concerned about the overt and covert effects of race in this country. Very quickly, I look at someone like Yusuf Salaam, who's a city council member now. I remember that time in history. We're the same age, so I remember how it felt to be a young black man in that space and time. I still don't go to Central Park today. Have never been in Central
I'm
Park.
going to leave it at that. I'm over time, which puts me in trouble with CUNY. I try to make that line. Thank you. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum.